Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Isabel Bainton and I'm the commissioning editor for books on social work and children, young people and families at Policy Press, which is part of Bristol University Press. We're absolutely delighted to have published Safeguarding Young People Beyond the Family Home, and we're particularly thrilled to have been able to make this important work available open access. So if you haven't already downloaded a copy, there'll be a link, you'll find a link in the chat box to enable you to do that. As Michelle's mentioned, we are recording the session and that will be available afterwards via our YouTube channel. And I think we might be able to email that out via Eventbrite as well. So I'm delighted to welcome the author team. We've got Professors Michelle Lefevre and Carlene Firmin and Nathalie Huegler. Delphine Peace is on maternity leave at the moment and unfortunately can't be with us today, but we wanted to acknowledge her significant contribution to the book. There's always a bit of a danger of having a Bridget Jones moment, I feel, doing these things. So in a moment, I'm going to pass over to the authors to introduce themselves properly. They're going to be taking you through, talking to you about the background to the project, and then moving on to present some of the research findings. I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions to ask the team, so we've allowed half an hour for Q&A at the end. Please pop your questions in the Q&A box for that. So over to the authors now. Michelle, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen because we've got a number of slides and we thought it'd be kind of easier rather than do one kind of introduction and then a presentation. We thought we'd start and do it all kind of integrated really. So I'm Michelle Lefevre and I'm Professor of Social Work at the University of Sussex, and I have a background in social work and psychotherapy with children and young people at risk, and quite a lot of my work in the earlier days was around sexual abuse, then in the latterly around sexual exploitation as well. And so I've taken those interests into my research background as well. And I suppose that is what led to the Innovate project, which is the overall research project through which this book has been produced. So we've been funded by the Social and Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, the ESRC, for 4 years to work around this. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. We've got a lovely image of the book, the front cover of the book here. And we're really delighted to have Isabel Bainton from the Policy Press here because she has been our absolute rock and support all the way through. And we're hoping to talk to her again about this, about doing another project book as well, so she doesn't know that bit yet. So the Innovate project, you can see all of our logos at the front there. So the University of Sussex, that's where I'm from and Nathalie's from. And so we're holding the project, but Carlene at Durham is a co-investigator, and we've also got colleagues at Innovation Unit, which is a social enterprise, and Research in Practice, I'm sure most of you will know, is a leading charity around developing work in this field too. So why did we think a book was necessary? So I suppose these questions and issues will be really at the forefront of your minds, those of you who are working in this field. We knew there are a number of evidence problems about extrafamilial risks and harms. There are terminology differences across countries. When we started to map the field in the first year of our project, we started to realise, although in England in particular, we call extrafamilial harm is the most common term, but there's also harm beyond the home is another term increasingly used. But in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, different terms might be used at other times. And in other countries in Europe, in other Anglophone countries, the US, Australia, Africa, we were seeing different terminologies used and certainly no unified category. And in fact, that is still really relatively recent for us. I started as a social worker more than 30 years ago. We absolutely had no idea what this stuff was. We thought about risk and harm as coming from within the family, and service systems were set up solely to deal with that. So over the past 30 years, things have shifted, but they've still got quite a long way to go, particularly if we're supposed to have a kind of a unified response internationally as well, so we can understand the evidence base for what works with sexual exploitation, what works with criminal exploitation, when actually these terms don't really have the same kind of currency everywhere. So that's been one set of problems that we've faced as researchers, and we know that the practice field has faced. Then there's what we've called the adolescence problem, and that's very much in our little fingers there of, you know, how we as professionals understand children, childhood, youth, adolescence is really contested. It's really problematic. We struggle with it. We have very different views and opinions across disciplines as well. I suppose the first problem is the one I've started to refer to, which is about where the risk lies. So absolutely, children and young people, as they move through into adolescence, those years 13, 14, 15 in particular, start to get outside of parental control. Parents don't know what they're up to. The friendship groups are very hidden from parental view. And when professionals enter the field, we're even less able often to get in and to understand what's happening for young people. And it's also a really important aspect of adolescence to develop in that kind of way, to get increased autonomy, to explore, to take risks, to have relationships with different people, to do stuff, take drugs, to, you know, play away from home in all kinds of ways. So how do we then, as professionals, understand what is unsafe and not okay for young people? Where do those boundary lines lie? We're still working on those in all sorts of ways. One of the things that I've written about previously in particular has been about how to understand where vulnerability lies and where young people's agency should be respected. We know that if we try and overprotect young people, if we take away their mobile phones, if we police their friends, if we lock them up into secure units, then we know that they stop trusting us as professionals. They hide things even more, and paradoxically, that makes them even more at risk often. So that kind of taking away young people's agency and autonomy, it can be really, really counterproductive. So it's a big problem for us too. And then this other issue that I've started to refer to, which is how systems are set up. We've described it in our project as wicked service problems. So wicked problems are difficulties that society has in sorting out a pervasive chronic problem. I suppose things like child trafficking is a very common example of that. The refugee crisis is another common problem of that. There isn't a straightforward way in which to sort this out indefinitely. It requires new ways of thinking, sort of new paradigms to be shoving away the old ways of thinking about it. And what we see is that the systems that we have are often really stuck in their ways of doing things. There's silos between agencies, and young people can fall between those. So a young person who's caught with drugs, selling drugs, do they come under youth justice? They're committing a crime, public protection of the people in society, or should their vulnerability be thought about and understood? Should they come into a child protection paradigm, how does society feel about that if a young person's crime isn't thought about, responsibilized, and punished? So in the book, we really start to interrogate some of those issues. Should young people be responsibilized in these ways? What are the problems of doing so? And are certain young people particularly responsibilized and adultified in those ways? And how do we think about an individual focus as opposed to a family focus and a contextual focus? And in the future slides, we'll start to unpick some of those issues. So a little bit about the review that we did. So our project, the Innovate project, we're looking at how services and agencies develop new ways of responding to extra-familial risks and harms. And in particular, we're looking at contextual safeguarding, transitional safeguarding, and trauma-informed practice. So in the first year of the project, in 2020, we mapped the field and we did an evidence review, a formal evidence review, looking at what evidence there was, what research had been conducted that said these kinds of approaches were more or less helpful for children and young people. So we looked at journal articles, research and evaluation reports. We also looked at what we call the grey literature, so policy documents, practice commentaries, and so on. We did the standard database search that most of you will be familiar with, but we also put out a public call because we've got quite extensive networks. And we got a lot of really useful literature that way, often better than what we got through the database searches. And we also snowballed, so if we got a good article, we would look chase up the references in that as well. So this table here shows you what the literature looked like. So quite a lot of it was about organisational and system responses, and the other half was about interventions. So we refer to those two kinds of literature throughout the book. What sort of things do organisationally need to happen, and what can individuals do on their own? So there was quite a lot that was multi-agency in nature, and we've got a whole chapter in the book which is about interagency responses. A lot of the literature looked at CSC, so child sexual exploitation, I suppose, is the most developed literature base there is. There's been a longer recognition, certainly in this country, compared to, say, SYV as serious youth violence, so weapon-enabled violence and so on. And County Lines is actually 10% of the literature. And you would guess, I think, as well from that actually a lot of the literature was UK-based. And I think that does reflect the increased seriousness and systematization within which this country has started to look at these issues and develop more formal bases, both interventions-wise and systems-wise. So I think I'm handing over to Carlene now. So we can't see Carlene, I think we can hear you. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you can hear me. Is that okay?
That's
yeah, really sorry. The
right.
first time ever, I can't get my camera to work. So yeah, really sorry about that, everyone. But yeah, so in terms of how we started to organise the literature that we found, we had to look across a range of different harm types, and it became quite clear to us quite early on that there were some overlaps with these harm types that warranted kind of consideration. So rather than only looking at extrafamilial harm as one big group, or only looking at each of these harm types separately, we organised them into 5 clusters. So responses to harm that occurred via peer relationships, which would include things like serious youth violence, but would also include peer-to-peer partner violence, for example. Then harm that occurred via different forms of sexual abuse. So that would include young people who displayed harmful sexual behaviour and peer-to-peer sexual abuse, but also included child sexual abuse more broadly and issues like sexual exploitation. Harm that featured some form of criminality, so child criminal exploitation, drug distribution, that type of thing, modern slavery, gang affiliation. And then a key one for us in the literature was harm via exploitation, which obviously cut across issues like sexual abuse in terms of child sexual exploitation and criminality in terms of child criminal exploitation. We then also had a 5th harm type around radicalisation, with a lot of discussion about where this may or may not fit. We included in that trafficking and also violent extremism, but it was a much smaller cluster of papers that we included in that particular harm type. And what was really helpful about that was we were able to then see whether some of the patterns that were emerging and some of the response types we were identifying, whether they were particularly evidenced for certain forms of extrafamilial harm. And by doing that, we were very much able to see some clear variation. And it's worth noting that we're not clear whether this is a variation that exists because the harms are different, or a variation that exists because that's where responses have focused, or that's where evaluations have focused. So when we look at extrafamilial risk and harm that occurred via criminality or via peers, we were much more likely to see publications that talked about the need to address contexts that were associated with extrafamilial harm. Whereas when we looked at extrafamilial risk and harm via exploitation and sexual abuse, there was a greater focus on the use of relational working between young people and protective adults, and a greater promotion of effective interagency working as routes to effective social care responses. And I guess in terms of that variation, one of the things we may reflect on as we work through this event is we were seeing that kind of promotion of effective interagency working for things like sexual exploitation and other forms of sexual abuse, because there was a more of a belief, particularly in the UK literature, that changes have been made to how that system is already structured, legislative changes, practice changes. And so many of the recommendations focused on how you then implemented those system changes. Whereas for some harm types like child criminal exploitation, there was less confidence that the system was fit for purpose. And so we saw less of a promotion of effective interagency working and more of a promotion of significant system change. And nonetheless, both these groups of harm types, so extrafamilial risk and harm via criminality or peers, and extrafamilial risk and harm via exploitation and sexual abuse, literature in both those camps spoke about the importance of developing responses that address the specific characteristics of extrafamilial risk and harm, and to develop responses that were relevant to adolescents and youth-centred. And we'll focus on all of these as we work through this presentation today.
It's back to me. So we've got these 5 different kinds of system or intervention responses. So the first one, we've shortcut it as relational, but it refers to interventions and systems which draw on or aim to build relationships between young people and protective adults. Primarily, the literature was about professional relationships. There was a little bit about foster carers and some about family members, particularly parents, so fostering those kinds of relationships. But the principles were broadly the same regardless. Relational approaches enhance engagement with young people, how important that is. And so we started laying out there why that might be important. And in fact, many young people who are vulnerable to exploitation in particular, but other forms of extrafamilial risk and harm too, have forms of developmental trauma. They may have experienced abuse or neglect, family breakdown, other kinds of disruption in upbringing, and also for some young people, very, very dangerous contexts within which they were living. So that might be, there's places where there's lots of youth violence as well, but also feeling under pressure from the police in some examples as well. So feeling that, particularly for young Black males, a sense that they weren't safe in their neighbourhoods. So we needed to understand if that's young people's experience, either from inside or outside of the family, they were not going to trust professionals. So, and I remember this very much as a social worker myself. If you don't get that trust built up at the beginning by using every skill that you have, by using your respect and care for young people, you actually don't get anywhere. So it's all the therapeutic type of skills that you might imagine in terms of person-centered work, you know, being friendly, relatable and so on, relaxed and non-judgmental, showing unconditional positive regard. These young people were not getting that generally within the professional system. They were generally seen as troublesome, not troubled, and actually to be able to empathize, to think into their worlds, to mentalize for them, understand what's happening and to reflect that back to them in a respectful way was hugely important. That was shown really consistently through the literature. And frankly, I've written a lot about communication engagement with children and young people elsewhere, also for the Policy Press. It's really shown throughout the literature. So we need as professionals to be showing a real emotional attunement to young people, thinking about their lived experience, thinking about where they're at, and using ourselves. We are our own best resource always, using ourselves in those kinds of ways. And that thing about reliability and predictability too is really important in terms of showing that respect, building that trust as well. Because again, many of these young people, either before or after their involvement in extrafamilial risk, have had often quite unpredictable, quite scary, quite dangerous lives. And then I've also added this about the working alliance model as well. This came up really importantly in the literature. And it's about working person to person with these young people. So as another human being, it's both respectful and caring to do that. It works in a participatory way so that they are an equal partner working with us. We are trying to build systems and interventions that respect what they want, how they want services to be. So that kind of principle should lie right the way through that. So the second one, I mentioned that interagency working was really, really important. So finding ways of intra and inter-organizational structures and policies and protocols to make sure that these were operated to their best effect. So we saw a lot in the literature, the inconsistencies and discord in how young people and how they are seen and how they are worked with was being. So often there was a big difference, for example, between social workers and the police, or between voluntary sector social workers and statutory sector social workers. So there's different ways of people seeing and understanding their roles and how that responded to young people's involvement in criminal behaviours. That was often the most problematic distinction. But also in terms of protection. So we would see in some studies that practitioners in the voluntary sector would understand that issue, that if we don't respect young people's agency and their autonomy and try and work collaboratively with that, that we would lose the young person, that they wouldn't trust us, they wouldn't work with us. But often social workers and police and others in the statutory sector struggled with that. They knew they had a safeguarding responsibility and they found it hard to find a way through that complied with those statutory obligations without kind of completely overriding what the young person wants. So that was often played out between agencies. There could be splits in the system. So the introduction of protocols was really helpful with that, a set of guidelines that everybody worked with, but that was insufficient on its own. Interagency training was really helpful. So people could understand what their distinct roles and responsibilities were, and try and work from that understanding of how together they could find a way of working that would be useful. So I think we're back to Carlene next.
Thanks, Michelle. So yeah, the third feature of responses was the importance of them being contextual, and a range of contextual interventions with peer, school and community contexts that were associated with extrafamilial harm were recommended, particularly in the literature that focused on interventions rather than system change, recommended by over a third of the interventions literature that featured in this review. When systems rather than interventions were looked at, many studies evidenced the merit of a contextual intervention, but when able to document how that intervention sat within a wider social care system that also had the same level of contextual and focused impact. So we saw interventions with sports groups, with whole school environments, in community settings, with friendship networks, but these didn't sit within wider social care systems that were also focused on those contextual dynamics of extrafamilial harm. And what also emerged in this respect was that structural drivers of extrafamilial risk and harm, such as young people's exposure to racism, experiences of poverty and austerity, sexism within wider communities and societies, if they were unaddressed, undermined the sustained impact of the types of interventions that Michelle was describing below. And so many recommendations were made about interventions needing to mitigate the impact of these factors on the welfare of young people, and at the very least to avoid reinforcing them. So if you're delivering an intervention or piece of support for a young person, critically engaging with whether or not your interventions challenge the impact of racism or sexism on that young person's safety, and ensuring that the delivery of the intervention is not itself a source of racism, sexism, and so on and so forth, which was pretty integral to particularly thinking about how statutory systems can reinforce inequality, as well as act as a source of defence against it.
And Carlene, I just realised you didn't get a chance to introduce yourself properly, that we were supposed to be doing that. So the contextual slide is a good point for you to do that, isn't it?
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I think not having my screen sorted threw me a little bit, but as was mentioned, I think at the start, I'm a co-investigator on the Innovate project. I'm a professor of social work at Durham University, where I lead the contextual safeguarding research programme. So this particular theme was very relevant to a lot of the work that I deliver there. And we were particularly struck when looking at the contextual safeguarding strand of the literature, or the contextual strand of the literature here, that actually a lot of the work that we were seeing evidenced in relation to context was in respect of interventions as opposed to whole systems. And a lot of what contextual safeguarding looks at is how you reform whole systems. So it did raise questions for us in the book about how much work is still left to do, really, for systems to reflect this particular feature of social care responses. In the Innovate project, I provide expert input on contextual safeguarding, but also lead the strand of research that's looking at trauma-informed practice and response to extrafamilial harm.
Now my slides won't go forward. There we are.
I think I'm still with this slide. So the fourth feature of responses to extra-familial risk and harm was the need for them to be specific to this form of harm and to have these forms of harm in mind in terms of design. And again, we saw a variation between literature on interventions, discrete interventions, and literature on wider systems. Most of the interventions that featured in this study had been designed with extra-familial risk and harm in mind. Most of the social care systems that were under investigation had not been designed with extra-familial risk and harm in mind. And so you saw some challenges in the systems literature and some opportunities in the interventions literature. And the kind of three key features that were being discussed in that respect was firstly the need for responses to be broader in scope than having a focus on parenting as a source of protection for children and young people. So particularly not stopping at increasing parental capacity to protect, but also the need to consider peer, school and community contexts where extra-familial risk and harm occurred, and the capacity of those within those contexts to offer safety for young people. The second feature was the need for the response to be welfare rather than criminal justice orientated, and that included in response to young people who were committing offences in the context of being victimised through extra-familial risk and harm. And again, if we think about systems versus interventions, intervention responses to extra-familial risk and harm tended to focus on the young person and supporting them with their needs and their kind of whole being, whereas systems were often geared towards victims or offenders or criminal justice responses or welfare responses, and these young people would then fall through the gaps of those systems. And finally, the need for responses to recognise and respond to the gains, material or otherwise, that young people may experience when caught up in extra-familial harm. So really the importance of thinking about what is a young person gaining out of this situation. Is it money? Is it a sense of safety? Is it a sense of belonging? Is it protection of family members or others? And how do we mitigate that in terms of our response rather than ignore it, which is not the same, obviously, as responsibilising young people for the harm that they face, and that tension being a very live one. Interventions trying to offer something else, but systems often struggling to grapple with that gain in the context of abuse.
I'm handing over to Nathalie now to introduce herself as well.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Nathalie Huegler and I'm a research fellow in the Innovate project at the University of Sussex. And within the project, I focus on transitional safeguarding. So in terms of my role in contributing to the book, I guess I sort of brought that perspective of being particularly interested in the question of what happens to responses to harm outside the family beyond the sort of age of 18 and into early adulthood. So really this idea of focusing on youth-centered service and system responses, which recognise that youth and adolescents are really thought to extend into the early to mid-20s. So in terms of young people's developmental needs and just where they are at in relation to sort of social roles and development. And that responses also ultimately need to be embedded into a sort of whole life course perspective eventually. But I also brought to the book my specific perspective as someone who did their social work training in Germany, where I focused both on social work but also on social pedagogy. And it's a sort of context where youth work is not a separate profession or discipline, but very much part of the broader field of social work. So with social pedagogy, that's obviously an approach which looks very much at relationships, but also contexts in young people's lives. And, you know, both of these sort of form part of their life world, and that influences how services are then configured, for example, by using community-based and sort of youth-focused and youth-centered approaches. But also, having been a social work practitioner over many years, I still actually feel quite close in my research work to practice, and therefore it was really important to me and to all of us that this book would be open access to allow practitioners throughout the country to be able to sort of read it without, you know, the sort of the need for a paywall or sort of an affiliation access. So coming to the sort of youth-centered aspect of the review, so that's really emerged as an important aspect that really talks to taking into account the dynamics of adolescence when tailoring services and systems to make sure that they are both relevant for but also accessible to young people. So in terms of sort of relevance, that, you know, that part of that is really taking into account young people's sort of own perspectives and definitions, and not sort of rushing to a kind of labeling of young people as falling into particular categories, but really starting from their own sort of definitions and you know, their sort of voices. So really what this means is that, you know, the responses that build safety need to address context, but also relationships that really matter to young people. So they need to be situated within what I would call their life worlds. But also they need to be flexible and based on choice and collaborative practices. So really that means recognizing and working with young people's agency and their voice, you know, attending to their rights, and at the same time bearing in mind vulnerability, and really overall sort of attending to both protection and participation in terms of responses. But also another point is that responses therefore need to be tailored to meet young people's varying needs. So by no means are we thinking about young people as a sort of homogenous cohort in any way. So there's obviously differences around age, ethnicity, but also you know, ability, sexuality, faith, and so on. So what might be summarized by some as the sort of social graces, different aspects that impact on young people's lives and experiences of harm outside the family. So an important aspect of that, again, with my sort of attention to transitional safeguarding, is to pay attention to the fact that young people shouldn't just be aging out of services without having, you know, something to transition into that meets their, you know, ongoing needs as young adults. So back to...
I can turn the slides again. Oh, there we are. Back to Carlene.
And back to me. Some key issues that we felt arise from a framework where we consider these 5 features, and I can see a question has already popped up in the Q&A, so I'd be really interested to hear what some of your thoughts are. But for us, these 5 that we close the book with to help people think about how they might use the framework we present in the book in the development and ongoing delivery of social care responses to extra-familial risks and harms. The first being that obviously I outlined the importance of contextual interventions, Michelle outlined the importance of relational interventions, and when we look at what each of those groups of findings tell us, what we were really concluding was the importance of employing them both as reinforcing rather than as opposing practice approaches. In particular, that if you deliver relational practices in contexts that remain unsafe, that can undermine relationships and the sustained impact of safe relationships for young people affected by extra-familial risks and harms. But likewise, you require trusting, safe, secure relationships in contexts that matter to young people, as Nathalie was saying, in order to build safety in friendship groups, in school environments, in public spaces where young people spend their time. So while our development of interventions and definitely the literature in terms of things like sexual exploitation versus criminal exploitation separate out contextual and relational responses, the review overall suggested that they are likely best used as reinforcing practice approaches. The second conclusion we drew was that really to develop social care responses to extra-familial risks and harms, we need to likely trouble and in many respects re-envision the role of statutory social work and how we define vulnerability in terms of those in need of support and protection. What we saw in terms of challenges and barriers to development in this area were when not only the role of social work was called into question, for example, developing responses that went beyond addressing parenting capacity, but that shifting role also brought questions for the role of the partners that work with social care. So what does this mean for policing? What does this mean for the voluntary sector, who may have traditionally responded to a number of these issues prior to the increased involvement of statutory social work, particularly in a UK context? So a lot of reimagining of the role of social work featuring in a number of the publications. The third kind of issue that arose from this study was the need to develop services which integrated youth justice and social justice responses to extra-familial risk and harm, and challenged them as polarized ways of conceptualizing service delivery and conceptualizing young people in need of support. And if we situate that within the development of policy in this area, which we do at the outset of the book, this is a real challenge, particularly in a UK setting, where in terms of the Children Act 1989, for example, we saw an explicit desire to separate out a youth justice pathway and a child protection pathway, with the child protection pathway focused on acting against parents in order to protect children, and the youth justice pathway focused on acting against young people or intervening with young people as a source of protection. Extra-familial risk and harms and social care responses to them are pulling these pathways back together again, but in doing so we're merging concepts that have become very polarized in terms of how we position young people and what the objectives are of various services, whether it's a reduction in offending or an increase in protection. The fourth issue that arises is that this issue of structural harm as being very relevant to the delivery and the impact of services, and not that we just deliver interventions in a context of kind of varying structural forces, but actually we need to think about whether our interventions have any chance at mitigating these impacts and at least avoid reinforcing those impacts. And we can see with some interventions such as disproportionate school exclusions, young people's experiences of policing, particularly the experiences of Black young people, Black young men, for example, that our interventions may in fact be a source of structural harm and definitely not be mitigating them as a means of protecting young people from extra-familial risk and harm. And in the UK, most recently, the critique again about the gangs matrix and the young people that were placed on the gangs matrix, and the kind of very racialized nature of the matrix being another example of kind of services reinforcing structural harm rather than addressing it as a means of safeguarding young people's welfare. And finally, therefore, the need, particularly thinking about the findings around youth-centred responses, the need for us to ethically innovate in this area through co-production with young people rather than doing to them. The review really highlighting the need to centre young people's kind of developmental needs, experiences, identities, and to utilise those in the delivery and production of responses, rather than to try to manage adolescence as a challenge, but actually to use these as resources for the development of relevant and effective responses.
Young people, it's like young people is seen to be sort of controlled or,
yes,
you know, locked up in some kind of way. So we're kind of at the end of our presentation bit. We're going to ask people to put in the Q&A. We've got somebody who's put one in already, but put as many questions as you can, and hopefully we'll be able to bring you in to speak to those. We've got here the link to our book. I think Natalie has put it in the chat several times. So you can buy the book as a paperback. It's not very expensive actually for a paperback, but it was really important to us that you could download the whole book either as a PDF or chapter by chapter, share it around your teams, and do let us know what you think. So with the project more generally, we're developing a lot of different resources around innovation, around trauma-informed practice, around contextual safeguarding, and around transitional safeguarding, trying to take forward our thinking about extra-familial risks and harms as much as we can. We're on Twitter. We're going to have lots more webinars and conferences and things like that to come. So if you sign up, you'll get access to those, information about those at an earlier stage. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and start going to the Q&A. We've got 2 in there. Now, Nick Marsh, you were the first to put a chat up. I'm going to press answer live. Let's see if you can speak and read out your question. If not, we'll read it out for you. So can you speak, Nick? No, well, I'm going to read it out. So it's, what does this split in literature regarding child sexual exploitation and child criminal exploitation mean for our understanding for boys or our interventions with boys? So I don't know which of us would like. Oh, you've come into the room.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Go on. You can say that again now, because I was so busy concentrating.
So I was just wondering, with regards to the literature that you've reviewed as part of the project and as part of this book, and you opened up by saying the literature is 80% CSE, which has a traditional connotation with females, and 10 to 20% males. I don't know if I've got those stats right. And I just, CC, sorry. And I'm just wondering what this means for our understanding around our interventions, the effectiveness of interventions, or what interventions work with boys in both child sexual exploitation and child criminal exploitation. And then thinking beyond that around young people from diverse backgrounds, so Black young boys, South Asian young boys, etc. So I don't know if you had any findings in relation to that.
I'll kick off and then I'll let Carlene and Nathalie join in. So I'll say a bit, which is about, I think it gets played out in particular about who's recognised as a victim and who's thought of as a perpetrator. So in a situation that arises, the same behaviour in a girl is more likely to be seen as her having been victimised, having been coerced into a particular situation, and to need a welfare type response, particularly around the kinds of restrictions that I was talking about earlier. It's in an earlier study where that was one of the studies we included, where you know, a girl got her knickers taken away, got her mobile phone taken away. Every single boyfriend that she had was followed up. She couldn't stay overnight at her friends' houses because they would be police checked. And then eventually she was put into a secure unit. So that's how a girl in that situation was treated. And boys in that situation is far less likely to be seen in that way and to immediately being taken into the criminal justice system. So in fact, that is such an underpinning thing that it changes how everything else is done. So even if the social worker or the police officer or whoever goes in to want to work relationally, it's working with already within that context. And it's quite difficult for individual practitioners to override that. So one of the things we talk in the penultimate chapter is that individual practitioners can do all those things, relational, try to work interagency, try and be youth-centered, try and think contextually, think about the specific nature of extrafamilial risks and harms. But unless that's also echoed through a whole system approach, it's quite difficult to sustain that, to feel justified in what you're doing, and to be kind of trained and supported in that way of working as well. So that's my kickoff. Carlene and Nathalie, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I'll just add a couple of points. I mean, yes, the literature split, if we look at systems responses, was 34% focused on CSE, 12% on serious youth violence, 10% on county lines. But what I would say is we probably saw that gender split across this broad range. So it wasn't just CSE and CCE literature. We would have seen young men written about, particularly in literature on EFRH via criminality more generally, so in the serious youth violence literature, the gangs literature, and in the harmful sexual behaviour literature. And I think the harmful sexual behaviour literature is probably the one that bucks the trend slightly and sits more in the sexual abuse, well, it does sit in the sexual abuse category and sits in the more relational category, and still the dominant kind of service user group would have been young men, albeit probably white young men. As a group, but what you saw then was a greater consideration of therapeutic responses and relational responses to harmful sexual behaviour, which you didn't see for kind of serious youth violence, gang affiliation, and child criminal exploitation. And we know in terms of the literature is restudying the responses, and we know those responses are identifying Black young men more readily for certain harm types, white young men for other harm types, young women for other harm types. And so you then inadvertently get that disproportionality coming through in terms of the literature. I do think it raises a really interesting question for us, which we can't answer. It's a speculative question about is that one of the reasons why we see more focus on relational working in the CSE literature? Do people feel more able to be relational with young women than they do with young men or with Black young men? Is that telling us something about how practices are developing? And how important, for example, is race in that? Because I think, as I said, we do see kind of literature on relational approaches in the harmful sexual behaviour literature, which is with young men, but not necessarily with Black young men, and not necessarily being referred into those therapeutic services. So I think there's definitely intersectional questions that would arise from this in terms of where the evidence has been developed so far and where systems and services have focused so far, not necessarily obviously in terms of what young people need and deserve, which is a holistic response and a recognition that they may experience a range of harm types, not the harm type they're most likely to be associated with by professionals or systems.
Thank you for that.
I think the only thing I would add to that is just to everything that's been said is the kind of intersection with age, of course, that, you know, age plays is another kind of increasing age would then add to the kind of whole perspective of young men being more readily kind of seen as perpetrators. So that's definitely something that kind of, you know, plays on top of that as well.
So we're going to invite our next question in, which is Paul Shuttleworth, who is a friend of Sussex. So if you're there, Paul, did you want to say out your question? Let's see if you, brilliant. Hi, Paul.
Hi, how are you doing? So this is a bit of a kind of horrible question, but and if I could ask two actually, but the main one is just, what would be the main message that you would give to practitioners from, I suppose, from the literature review, but also from the research? If you could only give one, what would it be?
So let's see what all the three of us pick. Yeah. I think mine would be, so if you think about working on your own and you haven't got that system around you, to try and combine that relationality and respect together, to try and bring those two things together. And it's the do no harm thing, I suppose. What that does is it tries to at least build trust and give that young person an experience of a professional who shows care, who does respect, who does listen, who does show some empathy. So if nothing else, what you do is give a young person that experience. That would be mine.
I think for me, I think what all of the 5 features have in common to varying degrees is they can be read as very disruptive, or they can be read as something we already knew and we already know. And I would invite practitioners to kind of adopt a posture of learning and curiosity, and really reflecting on how much they do the things that are in the book, how much they're enabled to do it, and to recognise that actually a lot of what we're talking about is the need to be disruptive, even if that's at a very micro level. Even the things that Michelle is talking about can be quite disruptive in terms of the systems and organisations that you're working in. And so to recognise that while we may feel more comfortable to think, oh yeah, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing this, actually kind of approach the book with a, what am I not doing? Where am I not bucking the kind of status quo, and how might the things in this book help me to think about that? Because ultimately we are describing something that is a disruption of the status quo rather than something that reinforces the status quo of social care systems, particularly in the UK.
Nathalie.
And I think adding to that, I mean, I think the first thing that came to me, and I think it's what I'm going to be sticking with, is the sort of the youth-centered aspect of it, because I guess that kind of maybe goes back to the kind of context I trained in, where youth was a sort of a kind of, you know, focus group of sort of social work and social pedagogy intervention. So I think a kind of real understanding of what it means to be youth-centered and to kind of have the voice of young people at the heart of this, and to really have an understanding of all the kind of contradictions that, you know, this phase of life kind of includes. So I think, yeah, starting from the sort of youth-centered with a sort of, you know, really having young people's voice, you know, agency and all these kind of things at the sort of back of your mind with everything that you do, and really basing everything on that kind of understanding, in addition to what Michelle and Carlene have said, of course.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And if we have time for a second question for you, we'll bring you back in.
Okay, great, thanks.
So the next person is anonymous, so I'll read this one out for them. Should we avoid referring to young people as vulnerable? Does it remove a young person's agency and undermine a strengths-based approach? This is all our favourite question, this one, because it's a bit of both and. So I've written a whole poem called Both And. You have to do both. In fact, I'll try and get the link for that and pop that in the chat later. Because if you go only in a strength-based way, you don't think about their vulnerabilities. So there's a whole tradition of that's also happened as well. We think about young people as being agentic, making choices in this way, and we don't see the constrained nature of these very ambiguous choices that young people face. So exploitation is all about that notion of exchange and choice, but it's not real choice, it's not free choice, it's not always even informed choice. So we understand why a certain young person might be vulnerable, then we'll make sense of that. But we've got to take a really carefully constructed view of what vulnerability is. Do we mean vulnerable because of developmental trauma in the ways that I talked about before? Or do we mean vulnerable because society has made them so? So for example, for young Black men who've been racialized by society, so that they stop and search all the time. Well, that makes them pretty vulnerable, really. So I don't know if my colleagues want to say a bit more about those.
I would just want to add to that. I think this idea of, there's so many different ways in which you can think of vulnerability. So, this kind of idea of vulnerability as a label, I think has come to be something that we then see as a kind of contradiction to agency. But if you think of vulnerability as something that actually applies pretty universally to all human beings, and is then kind of contextually and situationally kind of lived, and resilience in the same way is also kind of contextually and situationally lived, I think then, I think vulnerability has absolutely a place within that conversation, and it's actually quite an important one to draw to, but really not to sort of just use it as a sort of simplistic label, and instead to kind of think, well, what is it exactly that kind of, how exactly does vulnerability manifest itself?
Yeah, I would agree with the points that have just been made, and just say that's why it was one of our key conclusions, was that the book is actually asking us to reimagine what we mean by vulnerability, so to engage with that as a concept, but really think critically about it, and particularly in a way that is still youth-centered, so engages directly with young people's increasing desire for autonomy and sense of agency. So yeah, it's very much a conclusion that we reached in the book.
Now, I've put that both and paper I mentioned in the chat, and I've realised, of course, it's not open access, but if people email me, I can privately send you a copy of that. So I'll put my email into the chat in a moment. Next question. Somebody said also, please don't let me read aloud. This is not necessarily a question, but some thoughts. I work in education safeguarding in Kent, which is one of the local authorities Carlene and her team have been working with in developing the statutory response to extrafamilial risks and harms. Schools are expected to follow updated behaviour guidance published by the DfE, which is heavily influenced by someone who strongly believes that isolations, fixed term or permanent exclusions should be used more for children, showing signs that we know could indicate they're a victim to this form of abuse. Is there or are there any plans to work with the DfE to highlight how dangerous this advice could be for some young people? Carlene and Nathalie, I'll leave that to you. I've been reading aloud.
Yeah, I mean, we have raised with DfE and liaised with people like the Association for Schools and College Leaders around concerns, particularly in respect of zero tolerance policies within education, their disproportionate impact on young people who are racialised as Black or minoritized in other ways, their disproportionate impact on young people who are care experienced and young people with learning needs. Because they do not create context conducive with safety for young people who are identified as potentially causing harm, or young people who are identified as being harmed, and young people who straddle both of those identities. And a number of schools are aware of this and have raised concerns about it as well. But I do think we're operating in quite a difficult landscape in that respect. And there's an ongoing debate and discussion to be had about how you use and manage behaviour policies within a wider safeguarding agenda, rather than seeing them as separate, distinct, or kind of competing. And I think in a school context, they mirror this wider system challenge we have between criminal justice versus social care responses. Kind of in the school, we see that in terms of behaviour management and discipline versus safeguarding, when actually what we need is a safeguarding first and integrated response to these issues.
So we've run out of questions in the Q&A section. Is there any last questions that people have got? I think even if you raise your hand, we could see you.
Paul's second question, which
we do. Paul, now how do we get you back in?
I need to enable him to speak, I think.
Oh, and actually, while we're doing that, we've got one from Joy as well. So we'll bring Paul in and then Joy in as well.
So my question was from going from what practitioners to do to, and it was interesting hearing about the DFE. But I suppose we've got difficult decisions on the horizon, as the politicians are saying, which I think might be code for budget cuts. So where do you think the focus should be for policymakers? And yeah, where do you think that? Yeah.
Good question.
I think the only thing I can sort of say is not to do what happened last time and sort of focus the kind of cuts, you know, the burden of the cuts on kind of youth services and that kind of area, because I think the fallout from that is quite visible in this field. So that's not an answer. I know that's avoiding the question, but it's like not doing what happened last time around, I think, is one aspect.
I was just thinking as you were saying that, it's like, well, we haven't recovered from the last set of cuts. And I think that's what's so problematic. And, you know, I've said probably in every single forum I've been for the last 10 years, actually, we know some of what works is that time spent with young people. So again and again in the literature, having that relaxed time with young people to hang out in a cafe with them, build that relationship, be there when they're ready to speak, that is what counts. But unless you have a workload that enables you the time to do that, validates that as being, I think it was Sophie Halleck calls it non-work work. It is the work, that building that relationship, doing that time so that a young person feels that trust and starts to tell what's happening to them. That is the work. So cutting staff will not work. So I think that's, for me, that's the last thing that should happen. But in a sense, what we're trying to do on the Innovate project is find the most effective kind of approaches to working with extrafamilial risks and harms. So I suppose what we would say is once we have honed some of those things down, we're able to start saying to people, well, if you want to innovate, if you want to build a new system, these are some of the system principles you need to put in place. So that's what we started. I suppose that's what I've been focusing on particularly. Let's see how we do that. What are the mobilizers for innovation? What needs to be there? Like, you need senior leaders who are really bought into a new system, to bought into the idea and can put things into place. You need the new system to be designed with all of those who are implementing it. So the social workers who might feel that they're at the bottom of the food chain, they need to be the ones saying, this is what you've got to do to make this work. You need young people there, as we were saying earlier, to be there to design a system. You need parents there, you need community members to be there. So that's, I suppose that's saying not about cuts, but that's how you make it more effective. And more effective is value for money. Value for money isn't necessarily cheap, but it does what it says it's going to do and does it more effectively.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add would be that I think while there were definitely questions that were raised in this review about the need for some levels of specialism for different forms of extrafamilial risk and harms, I think there was enough about what was shared across the 5 kind of features of responses that to focus on whether our developing systems and interventions that meet those 5 features, rather than focusing on developing responses for, I don't know, the 15 different siloed harm types that we had to integrate in order to do this review. And historically that has been the direction of travel, to have a separate child criminal exploitation panel, to sexual exploitation panel, to gangs panel, to intimate partner violence panel, and all of that takes people's time at various panels and meetings and all these different checklists and forms, and we're not asking ourselves whether them as an integrated body of work provide space for relational working, address contextual factors, mitigate the impact of structural harm, facilitate shared understandings across partnerships, not just shared protocols. So we need to be asking whether we're resourcing that holistic approach rather than whether we're resourcing very siloed and often duplicating approaches within our systems.
Another great question, Paul, thank you. So we're probably going to be moving to our last question now. We've got Joy. I think we've got you in the room, Joy, have we?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, hello, thank you. Yeah, I'm just really interested in, thank you so much, that it's amazing to hear about this work, but in terms of children and young people who are seeking asylum, and in terms of where they are accommodated, and obviously it's very topical at the moment, and I think it's particularly challenging at the moment. So I suppose, how do we fit into that? How do we safeguard, or how do we contextually safeguard children in that position? I'm just really interested in your thoughts on that.
Let you speak first, Nathalie. This is your big topic, this one.
I mean, it's an area of practice I used to be involved in. So I think, again, it's very hard to do that in a context that isn't sort of centered around young people and their rights and their needs, and instead kind of has to focus on, issues such as, immigration control, agendas and so on. So I think the first step is to probably try and create spaces that are safe from that kind of intrusion into practice, because I don't think you can do anything that is, trust-based or contextual or relationship-based or trauma-informed or youth-centered or anything like that without sort of starting to kind of create that sort of safe space. So yeah, that would be, I think, the starting point. I think the current climate makes that difficult. The whole idea of sort of social workers undertaking age assessments makes it incredibly difficult. I think it's a very relevant question, but I think the only way is to really kind of try and create a space that kind of frees you up from that, and that sort of is probably both a sort of micro level practice but also a macro level practice of trying to resist some of the more kind of sort of intrusive and more what's the word for it that I'm looking for, the kind of, the things that intrude from where the immigration system and immigration controls intrude into social work practice. I think it's kind of resisting that at a macro level and at a micro level in everything that you do. So I'm not sure if I fully answered the question, but that's what would be my starting point.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that's probably coming to the end of our time now. So I don't know, Carlene and Nathalie, if there's any last things that you'd like to sort of say, take home messages from the book, or that we haven't already said?
Not from me, no. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground in that hour, so I've nothing further to add at this stage.
I mean, I think the only thing I would add to everything that's been said is, sometimes I think back to sort of my practitioner times, I think all of these things are sort of can be easier said than done, but yet, we sort of like must start somewhere. And I think the last question just kind of really reflected that as well, all the kind of challenges and barriers that stand in the way. But really, if we kind of try to do this from a position of seeing ourselves as a sort of, also as a rights-based profession, and as a sort of profession that, or as, people in the field who are, have young people sort of voice and participation and this kind of youth-centered ethos at our hearts, then I think that sets us up on a good course, hopefully.
Thank you both. What I've popped in the chat as well is another event that ourselves and our colleagues are involved in. So the research centre that I run, CERSE, the Centre for Innovation and Research in Childhood and Youth at Sussex, we're having a big symposium at the end of this month, and Carlene is going to be speaking again there. So I thought it was an opportunity for those of you who want to. We're going to have online access and do a similar sort of format to this, as well as something live in the room. So do copy that out of the chat. Go to Eventbrite and sign up if you want to join us for that as well. So on those, I'm going to thank Isabel very much for joining us. Isabel's had childcare issues as well today, so it's been one of those days, but it's been really lovely to, oh, here she is. Thank you very much, Isabel.
My pleasure.
And thank you to my co-authors, Carlene and Nathalie, and please do sign up on our website and join us at future webinars. We'll say bye-bye for now then.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.